Thank you, Lord, for giving us the intermission cocktail. My prevailing thought while watching the new Broadway transfer of the musical Tammy Faye, Tammy, you in danger, girl. Oh my god, hey, welcome back. My name is Mickey Jo, and I am a theatre critic here on social media. I am obsessed with all things theatre. Hello to you if you are watching this as a video on my theatre-themed YouTube channel. Hello to you if you are listening to this review on podcast platforms. I am currently in New York, where I have been for the past 2 weeks, seeing as many Broadway and off-Broadway plays and musicals as possible. I've already shared reviews here of Ragtime at New York City Center, of Romeo and Juliet at Circle in the Square, and of the brand new musical Maybe Happy Ending. In fact, there are 4 or 5 new musicals opening within 2 weeks here on Broadway, including Tammy Faye, which is what we are going to be discussing today. Now, I have the great opportunity to talk about how this show has evolved, because I saw and reviewed the world premiere production that took place a few Christmases ago in London at the Almeida Theatre. And this is such an interesting case study in terms of transatlantic transfers, because the Almeida Theatre has a capacity of around 300. This is not a West End theatre. This is off in Islington, in a different part of London. I wouldn't call it central. It's very much an off-West End house, even though it is eligible for our largest theatre awards, the Olivier Awards, at which its leading lady, Katie Brayben, won the Olivier Award for Best Leading Actress in a Musical, but it transferred straight away with no intermediary production to the Palace Theatre on Broadway, which has newly reopened after years of refurbishment, where they literally elevated it off of the ground so they could open retail space down below. Capitalism. And the Palace has a capacity of upwards of 1,000. Let me actually Google what this is. Palace Theatre capacity New York. That is going to be 1,648. So this has to be, in history, among the biggest upscales in terms of transfer, going from around 300 capacity to around 1,600. You may ask, what did they do to the show to, justify this, to upscale it? And we're going to talk about that, as well as many more details about it in today's full video review. Now, if you have already seen Tammy Faye on Broadway, or if you remember seeing it in London, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you want to hear more of my Broadway and worldwide theatre reviews, make sure you are following me on a podcast platform. If that's how you're hearing this, make sure you are subscribed right here on YouTube with the notifications turned on. There's a button below my face that does that, so you don't miss any of my upcoming theatrical coverage. You can also find more reviews that you won't necessarily see or hear on those platforms over on my Instagram and TikTok feeds, where I am MickeyJoTheatre. But now it is time, let me tell you all about Tammy Faye on Broadway. So some context to begin with. Tammy Faye is a biographic musical all about the life of the famous, notorious, fascinating televangelist Tammy Faye Bakker / Tammy Faye Mesner. She and her husband Jim Bakker participated in the rise of televangelism and became some of the most well-known, some of the most successful on that platform. They had their own satellite from which they broadcast these down-to-earth family messages of Christian values and faith. As the musical tells us, their approach was a little quirkier and a little bit more campy than some of their contemporaries, who were these very stern, comparatively fatalistic doomsday preachers proclaiming eternal damnation and fire and brimstone and all of that good stuff. But charming as their approach may have been, the Bakkers' lives and careers were not without their fair share of controversy. There was a major fraud case brought against her husband, Jim Bakker. He had his own personal demons to reckon with, and the later years of her life were even more interesting, where she became this unexpected gay icon, which is perhaps why this musical has been written by 3 openly gay creatives. It is scored by the iconic composer Sir Elton John, with lyrics by Jake Shears of the Scissor Sisters, who was recently seen in the West End revival of Cabaret, playing the MC, actually, and a book by the brilliant playwright James Graham. And it's that particular perspective on Tammy Faye's life that makes this both interesting and a little bit troubled, because upon its arrival to Broadway from London, this show still reckons with the same conflict that it had before, the same inner turmoil about whether it's going to be this sincere recount of her life or whether it's going to be a campy, parody, silly, fun take on that. And it offers both things interchangeably, which on the face of it sounds like a good idea. It's both informing and entertaining, except for the fact that it leaves the piece tonally confused, and it leaves the audience confused, because we don't know how much of this we're supposed to be laughing at, how much of it we're supposed to be taking seriously. I'll talk in more detail about that, but as one example to this, we meet a lot of these other evangelist, fundamentalist Christian characters, some of whom are certainly meant to be taken seriously, some of whom are legitimate antagonists, and others of whom, like, we meet the Pope, we meet the Archbishop of Canterbury, and these are very much comic caricatures who may as well be played by puppets. And not for nothing, the show also features puppets. The show also sits on both sides of the fence in terms of celebration and condemnation. It is very uplifting of Tammy Faye. It is very kind towards her and very compassionate towards the life that she led and the perspective that she had on just wanting to bring joy and comfort to people. It is sort of decently critical of her husband, Jim, and his exploits and the events of his life. It is certainly heavily critical of the likes of Jerry Falwell, but not so much of the Reverend Billy Graham. And, you know, there's blame to be laid at the feet of several of these individuals, and the musical really makes choices as to who the bad guys were in this situation, who was manipulated, and who was just a nice guy with great hair. And it's intriguing, it really is, because James Graham has, you know, written great plays about a lot of interesting historical chapters, and, you know, finds a way of deriving humor from those. If we look at Dear England, one of his most recent extraordinary stage successes, all about Gareth Southgate and his work managing the England men's football team, that is still sort of faithfully portrays the events and the central characters while offering these broader comic interpretations of sideline characters like the various British prime ministers who were in office during his time with the England football team. And I guess that's a similar approach to what they're trying to do here. But certainly in America, I think faith and religion and organized religion and Christian denominations, a heavily controversial and contentious topic to cover, because people within that audience are going to have very different feelings about the way that you portray that. Enduringly, if I may sort of describe to you the perspective of this show on faith towards the end of the thing. This is a little bit of a spoiler because this is where we end up, but it's not a spoiler in terms of plot. Tammy's final sort of a declaration to us as the audience is to implore people to realize how many more times the concept of love is mentioned in the Bible, literally how many more times the word appears than the word hate, that there is more joy and compassion and community and love thy neighbor and all of that good stuff to be found in this religious text in both testaments than there is condemnation and suffering and hatred and division. And that, I think, has the capacity to be a very healing and very powerful and necessary message for a lot of people. But this is not ancient history. And I do think this is one of those shows where it's necessary for you to arrive with a certain understanding of Tammy Faye beforehand, because the beginning of the thing kind of riffs on and jokes on a prior knowledge of who she is, even though they then go about jumping back in her life and showing how the televangelism thing started and her meeting with Jim and her rise to prominence. There's an awful lot that's left unsaid. And the fact that this premiered in London, where she really is not known culturally, made that even more confusing at the time. I'm reminded of Jersey Boys, which is not a musical that I care for, but at the beginning, they have this contextualizing thing where you hear a French early 2000s cover of Oh What a Night that's like, Ce soir est là, and then a narrator comes on and is like, that was our song being covered, establishing for the audience the impact that they had. And I wonder if Tammy Faye needs that kind of a moment. Jersey Boys, for what it's worth, doesn't, because everyone knows the music of Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Possibly when the show was being written, maybe not as much as now that Jersey Boys has been this like 20-year huge global success. But I think with a set that is full of TV screens, if we just had some clips, I think if we saw the real Tammy throughout, the whole thing would feel grounded in a certain amount more reality, and that could give us that depth and dimension so that then when we do the funny, silly shtick thing on stage, that then takes us back into that world. I think that would give it a more solid footing on the other side if they are going to keep trying to give with both hands. But certainly, if you go into this having no idea who Tammy Faye is, I think you may struggle a little bit more. For so much of it as well, it's not really about her. Jim is afforded a lot more of the thrust of this narrative. Jerry Falwell is our principal antagonist, but so much of what happens in the first act is happening to and because of Jim, and Tammy is really along for the ride, and that's the story they're trying to tell of someone who was caught up in, his decisions and his fraud and his ultimately criminal negligence, but it would still be great to give her more agency in that than just singing a sad song towards the end of Act 1, just like Katie did when she played Carole King in Beautiful, the Carole King musical. There are similarities, eerily enough. Now let's talk a little bit about the score. This is not Elton John's most memorable work in terms of, his own career or the work that he's done writing for the stage. I much prefer his scores to Billy Elliot, to Aida, certainly to The Lion King. There are some great tunes within this, and I give him an enormous amount of credit for trying to capture the sound of this time with the song that we hear Billy Graham singing, like "There's a light of the world is upon us." He utilizes that gospel sound. He writes a love duet for Jim and Tammy called Only Love. It's very Don't Go Breaking My Heart, in fact. But we are short a couple of really winning melodies that would elevate this score to something stronger. One of the standout songs right towards the end of the show is a ballad for Tammy called If You Came to See Me Cry, where she is, recalling everything that has happened to her in her life, and she is standing in her strength, and she is standing defiant of her critics and those who would love to see her downfall. Only I have a lyric problem with this, and truly the melody is not the most compelling thing, but the lyric problem that I have, and I thought this in London as well, and I hoped against hope that they would fix it, is at the beginning, it makes sense grammatically, and she sings, "If you came to see me cry, then whatever, I have no more tears left to give, whatever." And then at the end of that chorus, she repeats again, "If you came to see me cry." And that doesn't make grammatical sense to me. And perhaps I'm being pedantic and facetious here, and she's just repeating the idea, but as a solitary lyric, "If you came to see me cry," without conclusion, it doesn't make sense. Essentially, it's like, if you came to see me cry, I have bad news for you because I have no more tears. All of my devastation is gone, and now I'm just here who I am. If you came to see me cry. Like, I can almost get on board with it, but it just bugs me. For what it's worth, they also, during the curtain call, sing a little ditty called See You in Heaven, which is troublingly similar to Take Me to Heaven from Sister Act. In general, with the lyrics by Jake Shears, I think I had more of a problem with them in London. They didn't bother me so much last week when I saw the press preview performance of this at the Palace. But there's also every possibility that my standards for the quality of musical theatre lyrics have declined, as they have declined over the last few years. That sounds incredibly insulting, but I do think there's a little bit of truth in it. Less frequently these days am I like, wow, that is actually a really well-written lyric. And if there is truth in the story that Sir Elton John always composes with the lyric intact first and then scores something around that, then that may be where I lay some of the blame around the deficiencies of this score, I'm sorry to say. Because it just lacks bite. It's cutesy and it's pastiche and it's poppy, but it's those moments where music is utilized non-diegetically to articulate Tammy's feelings, to articulate Jim's feelings, and to move this narrative forwards and contend with some of the heavier and more serious themes that are happening, these conflicting ideas of faith and religion, and how best to approach that, and how best to propagate that, and influence people, and indoctrinate people to a certain extent, and prey upon their fears and their anxieties about their lives. James Graham's book takes all of this into account. I just don't know if the lyrics do to the same extent. The lyrics feel a little bit more superficial. That being said, I do not think that the script is without its critiques as well. One of the most egregious things to me is that we have this scene in the middle of the thing as Tammy is coming into her own, as she is making more choices about the way that their program should be run, about its ethos, about what it should contain. She is facing criticism even from her own friends, one of whom, Jan Crouch, who was a well-known figure in her own right, openly homophobic, and criticized her for interviewing an American pastor who had been diagnosed HIV positive, which is something that historically happened. However, as it is shown in the show, she has him in their studio, sat on a sofa. Ogie's mad about it as well. And after a conversation about the misinformation being spread around the transmission of HIV and AIDS at the time, in the show, Tammy stands up and goes over and hugs him, and everyone is scandalized by this, and it's seen as this completely outrageous thing that she did. And you would think, watching this biographic show, that actually happened, and it didn't, because that actual interview was conducted via satellite link or whatever the technology was. He was on a TV screen within her studio setup, and she was talking to a television set. She may have hugged the television. I haven't watched the interview, but she didn't hug the man. They're conflating it with the story of Princess Diana hugging AIDS patients, HIV positive patients during a hospital visit around the same time during the AIDS crisis. And they're taking those two sort of moments of outreach from women who would become beloved gay icons, and they are putting them together in a way that is not historically true. And I appreciate that what she did was still groundbreaking. It was still this landmark moment of outreach and acceptance and compassion. And if we were to just see her talking to a TV set, we wouldn't really feel the weight of that, because it's hard to imagine how stigmatized it was at the time. And so the hug, I think, brings that emotion about for a contemporary audience, and it allows us to feel the impact of what she did and feel how meaningful that was in our own way. However, they repeat it again at the end, and it's really the emotional heart of the show, and kind of the only coverage of Tammy's gay icon status. This is the other criticism I have, is everything that the show didn't tell us after the fact. We follow the arc of Jim Bakker, his rise, his crime, his incarceration, his coming to terms with parts of his identity that he felt ashamed of. And without me saying what that is, I feel like you can read between the Christian lines here and figure out what that was. And in her later years, like I said, Tammy Faye would become this gay icon. She was interviewed on the RuPaul show, for crying out loud. I first discovered who Tammy Faye was because she was invoked in a lot of American drag culture. And she is this fascinating personality who began to look more and more like a drag queen, who was this glamorous figure who preached evangelism in a different way. She deserves so much more of the thrust of her own narrative, and we didn't get that chapter of her life. She says offhand right towards the end, I couldn't have got through it all if it wasn't for the gays. We don't see that. 3 gay men have written this show, and they don't document and portray the period of her life where she became this beloved gay icon. Anyway, let me move on now and tell you about the production and any changes implemented from London. So this has been directed by Rupert Goold, artistic director of the Almeida, and I wish I had a clearer recollection of exact moments within the Almeida production. Broadly, it's pretty damn similar. It's the same set, it's the same creative production, which I think is a shortcoming in a way, because like I said, you're going from this small space at the Almeida to the Palace Theatre on Broadway. I don't think the production is the biggest issue. I think there is more problem within the material, but certainly I think there's more they could have done to demand that scale of a Broadway stage. Even among Broadway theatres, the Palace is big. And they still retain the scenic design by Bunny Christie with a grid of television screens that occasionally show live feed captured via cameras, which they were doing before Sunset Boulevard, by the way. And occasionally these also open up to see little people standing there like it's Hollywood Squares. Again, campy and often used to house serious figures offering serious opinions. So again, there is a total struggle going on within this set design. We can also deliberately see into the wings. We can see people standing at the sides of stage during moments of broadcast. There is one particularly impactful one during the first act when Tammy is left to host the show alone for the first time and is open with the TV audience about how nervous she is and reaches out to them with her hands. We kind of see the beginning of what would become her impact and her legacy. I like the way this is staged with all of the onlookers. Somehow them being there makes her feel even more isolated and alone in the middle of that stage. There is also a slightly Sunset Boulevard-esque moment at the start of the second act where we see a feed of her getting ready backstage and a short scene play out, and she begins to sing a song before walking down a corridor and then rising up through the stage to do this disco number. And they did use cameras at the Almeida. I don't remember if they had that sequence exactly. I don't feel like I recall that. What I do remember is that there were multiple songs in the second act that have either been reworked into different songs or cut entirely. Jerry Falwell had this great song where he kept singing this lyric about the road to Damascus, and I think that, as opposed to the rest of his material, which feels very much motivated by his own political self-interest and by his own clutches at power, that song really cemented his faith and his beliefs among his motivations. And it was during that number, as Zubin Varla sang that in London, that I remember thinking to myself, oh, he's going to win an award for this. And that number doesn't happen in the Broadway production, and I don't think Michael Cerveris is going to win the Tony, sadly. But we will talk about the performances later. There was another number around the same time called Bring Me the Face of Tammy Bakker, or Bring Me the Head of Tammy Bakker. It was sort of this mob mentality song, but it was also the closest we got to talking about the way her image was received by the American public. That is now gone as well. And I should say, if I suggested at any point that they should lean away from the campy, I don't think that's the solution here. I think the way to fix this show is to lean into the campy. And I'm reminded, bizarrely, of the upcoming, I think it's the Pharrell biopic film that's going to be done in Lego, and I'm so fascinated by the idea of using a slightly different tone or a slightly different medium to tell this story. And if it's Tammy Faye reflecting on her own life, by the time we meet her in her older years, she's kooky, she's campy, she is eccentric, and the way she would recall her own story would be through that kind of, if not a rose-tinted lens, then a kaleidoscopic one. And so I have a lot of time for it being even more bizarre, even more campy. One of the really great numbers is a song called He's Inside You, where we are exaggerating the extent to which Tammy and Jim's broadcasts were alternative by singing a very sexually suggestive song about the Lord. They're singing, he's inside you, he's inside us all, he sure ain't small, he's inside women and he's inside men. It also foreshadows revelations that come later in the show, but that's fun, and it's funny, and we're having a good time. And not unlike Diana the Musical, if the road beneath, in terms of the material, is going to be a little bit rocky, at the very least, it would be nice to have a good time. I will say it was very interesting seeing this after the most recent devastating US election, because there are moments within the text, they play on the idea, they pun on the idea of Make America Great Again, and certainly we see conspiracy among some of these fundamentalist Christians about manipulating the American public and reintroducing Christianity into US politics and into the presidential campaign. We see conference between Jerry Falwell and Ronald Reagan that suggests as much. There's an entire section where Jerry talks about having this opportunity to sort of permanently ground the American consciousness in a place of Christianity and gain ground on the assertion of Christian family values in American politics for years to come, an impact that I think is still being felt now. But all of this could really go there. We could see more debate between these characters and between these ideologies. I think we are too preoccupied with telling the events of her life than really getting into the meat of the thing, especially when the events of her life aren't even really retold faithfully, which is fine if we're going to lean in and do this campy, like as Tammy would have imagined and remembered it thing, but that doesn't seem to be what we're doing either. Truly a show with an identity crisis. I enjoy Lynn Page's choreography, it's of the era, it's campy, it's fun. The hair and makeup design is probably my favorite creative element out of the entire thing. That is credited to Luke Verschuren for Campbell Young Associates. And I do also appreciate Finn Ross's video design, as well as the way that it was utilized in the overall production. There are some very emotionally moving moments of when they are blowing up their faces onto the screen behind or depicting many different versions of themselves. This is used well. There are moments where we struggle to find Tammy with the camera a little bit, and a little pet peeve is the fact that we see two sort of studio cameras on stage, and at no point do we see feed from those, like they are just pointless props. But I feel we have talked enough about the flaws in this material and in this production. Let me tell you about the performances. Now, this central performance from Katie Brayben, Olivier Award winning for this role, is tremendous. It is a feat. I have been telling people now for some time to include her in this conversation about brilliant leading actresses on Broadway this year. Sadly, I don't think the show is going to have the life and the impact that would support her Tony's campaign. I hope she still gets a Tony Award nomination for the great performance she is giving. The characterization is wonderful. The way in the first few scenes of the show that she switches from the later in life Tammy that we see to a younger, more naive, less outgoing version of herself, but still with that quirky charm, created, I think, by everything that she had gone through previously in her life, by the poverty that she had experienced, by the hardships that she had endured. She is this fascinating character, and Katie Brayben makes her fascinating and makes her compelling and has really crafted her in a very nuanced and substantial way, especially as we enter into the second act and, she asserts her own dignity and refuses to really fully forgive her husband for his transgressions. She also has that starry quality and that warmth about her essential to Tammy Faye, when this is a story all about how she became a beloved figure just by being on people's televisions and, telling them to reach out to her and that she's going to take care of them. And you get that 100% from Katie Brayben. She's also hilariously funny. They reworked during previews, I believe, some of the lines in the first scene to make them a little less shocking, but there's still some great one-liners that she says to a slightly flustered gay proctologist who she has sought out because, in her own words, it's the closest thing that she's going to get to a female proctologist. In short, she's a star. She's fantastic. And if you indulge in diva worship, which I dare say many of us do, then worth going to see the show just for her performance, exclusively for her performance. She's wonderful in it, she really is. Now, Christian Borle has joined this production as Jim Bakker, and I say joined because in the original London version, it was Katie and Andrew Rannells, giving us this double-barrel brilliance because he was fantastic as Jim Bakker. He was announced to be opening the Broadway production alongside her, but at a press event in the run-up to rehearsals, he surprised everyone by confirming that he would no longer be appearing in Tammy Faye as they had failed to reach terms of agreement, the implication of which is money. So after he exited the production, they instead cast his Falsettos co-star Christian Borle. Christian, who is this wonderful, versatile actor, a multi-Tony Award-winning actor who has been wonderful in so many things. He is this fantastic, eccentric comic presence. He's had a really eclectic, celebrated stage career, and I've enjoyed him on stage before. I am sad to say I feel like he is fundamentally miscast here. And it's not just because having a gay actor, I think, lends a little more authenticity to the breakdown that comes after he's incarcerated in the second act. It's also just because tonally, he doesn't really sit in the right place, not in the same place that Andrew Rannells did. They're very different performers. And Jim Bakker at the beginning is this slightly campy sitcom husband kind of a character who, when he's singing Heritage USA and coming up with these big ideas to make more money and welcome more people into their family, do a little bit of fraud on the side, kind of turns into an Osmond brother, at least in the way that he's depicted within the musical that this is, and then has to contend with becoming a fully dimensional character in the immediate aftermath of that. And Andrew Rannells, I think, gave one of the most brilliant performances of his career as this character. He was really wonderful as Jim Bakker, and Christian can't seem to be able to access some of the same things. Tonally, not quite the same charm, not quite the same youthful innocence and naivete. Sadly, it's a performance that is a little uncomfortable, and that's kind of the last thing that we want here. If I was to pitch replacements for Andrew Rannells, who I think may have been more in line with the version of the character that he helped to create, someone like a Neil Patrick Harris, perhaps, somebody like a Sean Hayes, even. Now, the principal trio is completed by Tony Award winner Michael Cerveris, who is playing Jerry Falwell. I was very excited to see him cast in this because this was such a substantial, interesting antagonist role for Zubin Vala in London, who also won the Olivier Award for that production. And I'm sad to say I think the role has just been diminished here because I don't think that Cerveris really has the necessary weight in his material to give as compelling a performance as we know he can from his wider body of work. He feels like a villainous caricature constantly fighting against this campy, insincere tone and given none of the tools to really develop his own place among that. And so he is neither fleshed out enough in his material to feel like a real person, nor, exaggerated and over the top enough to play with everyone else. Now, there is charm abundant in the supporting cast who share many roles. Among them, the West End's own Mark Evans plays Billy Graham, as well as the reporter who breaks the story about Jim Bakker's criminal activity later in the second act. Gives a lovely variety between those two, gives us a lot of showmanship as Billy in the beginning. But there's also great work from Alison Gwynn, from Ian Lasseter, from Raymond J. Lee, from Daniel Torres, as well as Max Gordon-Moore and Alana Pollard, who plays Jessica Hahn, a very interesting role, who initially is this adoring fan of Jim Bakker, who is sort of weaponized as a pawn in this takedown of him. Everyone is, I think, acquitting themselves well among challenges. And there's a story to be told here. There is a fascinating character and a fascinating story here, and much of the material moves in the right direction of doing that. It's just very confused among itself, and we just end up getting more and more mystified by what we're seeing on stage. We are rarely, if ever, emotionally captivated by it. The best it can be is charming and charmingly absurd, but it looks bright and it is performed with character and eccentricity. And so, if you have a drink and you go to the palace, you can find a way to have a fun time. It's not a hard watch, it's just a confusing one. And that, I think, is the kindest review I can give to Tammy Faye. I don't know that it's long for this world, not just because of the show itself, but also because I think it's a hard concept to sell at the palace, which is this large space. Already for many performances, they are not selling the balcony seating, and I have heard rumors that the writing may be on the wall. I would encourage you, if you have any interest in going to see this, please book a ticket to go see Tammy Faye, go and see these performers, go and see Katie Brayben giving this tour de force performance as Tammy Faye. Chances are, if you're intrigued by this material, if you liked Diana the musical, I think that might be a good sort of a litmus test for how much fun you are able to have at this show. In any case, those have been my thoughts about Tammy Faye. As always, please comment down below. I would love to hear what other people think about this show, especially if you disagree with me on this occasion. If you loved this, if you thought this was brilliant, tell us why in the comments section. Thank you so much for engaging with this review, for either watching or listening. I hope that you enjoyed. Make sure to follow me or subscribe wherever you are seeing my face or hearing my voice. There will be many more Broadway and West End reviews coming very soon, as well as plenty more theatrical coverage from me all across the internet. You can find me at MickeyJoTheatre on YouTube, on podcast platforms, on Instagram, TikTok, and the app formerly known as Twitter. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!